Welcome back, everybody. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are either listening to or watching the Phil Ferguson Show, both formats, so you can pick and choose whatever you like. If you like to see people talking, that's YouTube. If you want more content than just this interview, the podcast, of course, has all kinds of stuff about politics, religion, investments, and that kind of all gets wrapped up today with our amazing guest, Katherine Stewart. She talks about politics and money and religion. It's like your books were made for me. Everybody, welcome Katherine Stewart. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me. It's like all the stuff that your mother tells you to keep to yourself. We're going to be talking about today, politics, religion, and money. So I'm
I
looking forward to the conversation.
I often tell people, what's my show about? And I say politics, religion, and money, the three things you should not discuss with your family. So, uh, another thing we're in sync there. Before we get to the new book, just real quick, I want to recap. Your first book was The Good News Club, which was an organization that goes into elementary schools to teach kids how to be good Christians. Can you give us a minute on that and why people should get by it?
Sure. Well, the Good News Club is a program of religious sort of indoctrination and conversion sponsored by an organization called the Child Evangelism Fellowship. And I first got interested in the whole topic of the rise of the religious right as a political force when the Good News Club came to my daughter's public elementary school in Santa Barbara, California. Now, these clubs were entering, the K through 5 level. So these are, the materials targeted children who are too young to read. And I could see that they were confusing kids into thinking that their public elementary school sponsored a certain kind of religion because really little kids cannot make a
No.
distinction between an activity in their school and one that's sponsored by their school. So I was kind of astonished to discover that this kind of activity that was confusing these kids was legal and constitutional given our separation of church and state. So I started, long story short, I started researching the legal advocacy organizations that had pushed for a Supreme Court decision that allowed these clubs to be active in elementary public schools, as opposed to, churches and public parks and homes and any number of other places where people are free to practice their faith. And that sort of, once I started to recognize the connections that this legal advocacy groups had these very strategic connections, they were part of a much larger network. They had all these different alliances. I recognized that the story was much bigger than I imagined. And I discovered that these good news clubs were just one small part of a larger effort to basically destroy public education as we
Right.
know it and loosen the sort of help crumble the wall between separation of church and state, which is crumbling, but also that this story was really just one feature of a much larger story to destroy American democracy. So Money Lies in God is my third book on the topic. My second book on the topic, The Power Worshippers, really investigates religious nationalism, the movement, its features, and Money Lies in God takes an even broader look at the anti-democratic movement more broadly. The religious right is one piece of it, but it's not the only piece.
And of course, I thought one of the wonderful ways to frame it in Money Lies in God is talking about these very different groups that have different goals and agendas and desires are somehow working together. And I don't want to try to summarize the book, but maybe you can give us those groups and how they work together.
Yeah, great. I mean, there's so much to say here. So first, money is a huge part of the story, meaning that huge concentrations of wealth have destabilized the political system in some pretty interesting ways. Huge concentrations of wealth, I should say, at the tippy top of the economic ladder. The second, lies or conscious disinformation is another huge feature of the anti-democratic movement. And of course, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is religious nationalism or Christian nationalism. So when we're talking about the different groups, first I pay very close attention to the funders. They're the people who are, funding the movement. Literally, many of them are billionaires or multi-millionaires, and they're investing a portion of their fortunes in the destruction of democracy or in anti-democratic projects. So when I name a lot of them in Money, Lies, and God, and I'll just throw out a few names here. The Corkerys or Barry Side or the Wilkes brothers, Tim Dunn, members of the DeVos Prince family juggernaut. The funders are not any one type. So, I mean, this is really important. Some are evangelical, some are Catholic, some are Protestant, some are Jewish, and others are frankly atheistic. Think about some of those tech bros who are getting involved. So religiously, they're all over the place, but they want economic policies that are going to not just justify, but also increase their massive concentrations of wealth, and which are in fact making life a lot harder for people, ordinary working people. And they want to crush liberalism and what they call the administrative state. But a lot of people are going to be hurt if they succeed in destroying a public administration, as we're seeing happening before our eyes with
Right.
Doge, right? Subject to ethics rules. So this is where the lies fits into the title. There's just been this tremendous campaign against government, and there's a sector of the movement that has been very open about wanting to destroy it. And so in the Money, Lies, and God, I pay very close attention to this group called the Thinkers. There are many of them affiliated with a movement called the New Right, and they're the ones who started speaking really openly about smashing the administrative state. Now, technically, I would say the intellectuals of the New Right, many of them are not explicitly Christian nationalists. Some are, like Russell Vogt, who now is Trump's director of Office of Management and Budget. But some aren't. Some actually seem quite nihilistic and draw inspiration from political theorists associated with the Nazis, like
Yeah.
Carl Schmitt. But they seem more driven by, I would say, political conflicts. But for them, it's really about power. And they criticize liberal elites all the time, but they really want to be a new elite, right? They want to be the ones they're always bashing elite educational institutions, but many, if not most of them, have Ivy League degrees or at least degrees from universities that are really very sort of,
Fancy,
kind
fancy.
of fancy up there, right? So, then, of course, I talk about religious nationalism. It's it motivates a lot of the voters, and it also motivates a lot of the local activists. The voters, rank and file, I refer to as the foot soldiers, and many of them may not themselves identify as Christian nationalists, but with their actions, with their votes, they're lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. And this rank and file, as I show, really has to be distinguished from a cadre of leaders, of political pastors, national activists, cohorts that I call the sergeants and the power players. And they're often the ones sort of driving the agenda. They're the ones who articulate Christian nationalism, I would say, in its most extreme theocratic form. Um, so that's in a nutshell
Yeah.
the
That's it.
the book and its categories.
Yeah. That's all. Just those half a dozen to a dozen groups. It reminds me a lot of 1984, where you have a very small percentage that's in power, is going to stay in power. They do whatever it takes to stay in power. And then there's another group that thinks that maybe someday they'll be in power, but they're not. And then there's, I think it's in the book, is the proles, which is the common man who's entertained by tobacco, alcohol, movies, gambling, and as long as they're kept occupied,
Conspiracies.
yeah, the
Conspiracies. I reread
conspiracies.
actually 1984 last summer,
Yeah.
and it was kind of shockingly relevant.
Yeah, it kind of writes itself. And the book actually was finished late in 24 or even middle of 24.
I would say I was able to go in there at the very end after the 2024 election and make a few last
Uh,
minute word adjustments. But when I was writing the book, frankly, I thought I'd be accused of, hyperbolic thinking.
Yes.
I was imagining things. And really now, as we're seeing things happen so quickly before our eyes, I think if anything, I understated it.
Because I was able, thank you to you and your publisher, to get an advance copy to read. Then I got the audiobook because I was able to listen at 200% speed to get through it really quickly because my time is limited. And I kept having to say to myself, this didn't come out. I mean, this wasn't finalized last week. It wasn't finalized in January or February of 25. Uh, but the book is saying, here's things that could happen, which, like you said, 6 months ago, people might have said, you're nuts. You're being hyperbolic. But you almost laid out object for object, task for task, what they were going to do, which of course was all written in the Project 2025. What were some of those predictions that have now come true or in that general concept? What does it remind you of?
Oh my gosh, I mean, where to start? The decapitations at the FBI, turning over the Department of Justice as, an arm of it to a kind of MAGA loyalist kind of force, this idea that they're going to smash the institutions of a functioning, working government. They've been talking about that for a long time. Um, like the whole anti-DEI stuff, DEI meaning a sort of bucket that they throw into it anything they don't happen to like. It's a way to call into question the achievements of women and people of color if they're not sufficiently loyalist, of course. Um, the kind of strong arming of law firms, of corporations, of media bosses to say, you do things the way we want, or we won't play ball. Um, where to begin? I think a lot of the religious nationalist stuff is going to happen through the courts. But right now we're seeing, I think of the, anti-democratic movement or Project 2025 certainly is a marriage between the new right and the religious right. And I think right now we're seeing some really big moves. The destruction of our overseas alliances, which is really, really tragic. The destruction of America's soft power, which not only harms a lot of people around the world, but also harms us in ways that I think we have yet to realize. All of these things were foretold. It's not that movement leaders have been hiding. It's
Right.
that a lot of us have not been listening.
Again, I can't help it, but we go back to 1984. The world is divided up in three or four superpowers, and they control everything. And allegiances shift, and then the narrative shifts, and then the history shifts. And we have that now, where we're constantly being told that Europe is the bad guy. They're the suckers. They're the mooches. They're taking our money. They're taking from us. And there's this turning tide for people that have been our best friends, our allies, our business partners, our informational partners, everything. And we're calling them names. And of course, I'm sure you're aware of the events that happened in the near history here with this bombing campaign that was shared on Signal, which is an application. But this stuff is kind of all in 2025, like you said. And in your book, what do we do as just normal
Oh,
humans?
listen, there's so much to do. I mean, first of all, we have elections in less than 2 years. We have to remember that Trump, the country didn't just go MAGA, right? Trump did win the election, but if you look at the percentage by which he won and compared to the percentage by which other presidents win, it's a very, really, small margin. There's a graph out there that sort of shows the percentages. I mean, he won by a smaller percentage in 2024 than Biden won in 2020. Um, and listen, when they lost in 2020, they didn't get into bed and just sort of like put Netflix on,
Right.
constant repeat. They got out there to fight. Now, they did things that those of us who support democracy would never want to do. They spread lies, they spread disinformation and conspiracism. They inspired and, in some instances, sort of organized or helped organize political violence. But they also turned out their base. They went after low propensity voters. This is something the movement is really good at doing because the religious right really functions as a giant voter turnout machine in election cycles. They're very organized. They often operate through conservative or conservative leaning churches. Listen, in a country, Phil, where 40 to 50% of people don't bother to vote, and additional numbers have their votes sort of stolen from them through, I would say, dirty tricks, race-based gerrymandering, and voter suppression tactics, right? These silly laws about how you can't bring people water while they're
Yeah.
standing in line, like in a too long line to vote. Think about how it must be to be, an 80-year-old person who can't sit down. I mean, they're literally putting these kinds of laws into place because some of the Democratic leaning districts don't have enough voting places. You don't need a majority to win an election. All you need is a disproportionately motivated minority. So what they'll do is there are these very political pastors who are drawn into networks like Watchmen on the Wall and Faith Wins and the Courage Tour, and they'll give them these pastors, very sophisticated voter turnout tools,
Right.
data. They'll give them, electronic, QR codes that lead to a suite of tools they can use. They give them physical voter guides. They give them videos to air at church, and they know very well that if you can get people to vote on two or three issues, you can control their vote. So the issues are always like, human life or, anti-abortion messaging or, the new
Anti-trans.
is that's definitely one of the issues because whatever one thinks about that issue, it functions as a shiny bauble. It attracts everybody's attention. It's about affects relatively few people, you know, and
Yeah.
then you look at it and you're not looking at all the other stuff that's actually happening around you. And so the bigger picture, money, lies, and God. How are these funders of the movement going to get people to vote for economic policies that are going to increase their wealth, that are going to lead to tax cuts for them, that are going to take away environmental regulations, but also give them privileged contracts for monopolistic businesses and tax privileges. I'm looking at you, Mr. Elon Musk,
Hmm.
who received, I think it's $38 billion
Yeah.
in sort of taxpayer subsidy or support in some form. It's a lot. I mean, they're going
It
to
is
do
a
it
lot.
by doing litigating the culture wars and working with the religious right people. I don't think Musk or any of the sort of tech bros are really motivated, in any kind of genuine way by religious concerns. I mean, some maybe perhaps Peter Thiel, who's newly converted, but more to the point, they see that like working with the rest of the movement, with the religious right folks is the price of doing business. You
Right.
know, how do we get the little people on board? Well, we give them, bread and circuses or whatever they gave them in 1984. We're not there yet, you
Yeah.
know.
It's
Fortunately, that
it's
was a,
truly
a novel,
truly
but
amazing. Go ahead.
yeah, there's a kind of metaphor there.
Yeah, for decades, conservatives, Republicans, and their lip service organizations and blogs, podcasts cry about the liberal elites, the high educated, people with all this wealth are taking things away from you, average man and woman in America. Don't trust them. Vote for us. We'll go in and we'll break everything or we'll fix everything. Uh, and now we have the richest of the richest people in the United States and presumably around the world are now pulling the strings, and we're cutting basic services like feeding hungry children so that we can take another percent or two off the tax rates for people that have hundreds of millions of dollars. It
Mhm.
is absolutely staggering that whether it's a third or 35% of the American population is okay to vote with this. Uh, so how do we fix it? I mean, do we just find our own billionaires to fight it?
Well, I think for, the first thing, there's so much to do, it's important to engage in locally. There's no substitute for turning out the vote. It's really important to turn out the base of Democratic voters and also to go after low propensity voters, which is what they did. In this election, Trump got, when you factor in the number of people who could vote, he got pretty much the same number. It was up a bit because the number of people could potentially vote was up a bit.
Right.
But there was a reduced enthusiasm for the vote on the Democratic side. I think a lot of people don't understand what's at stake. I think that, you know, one, we need to help people understand what's at stake by conveying to them the bigger picture stuff. So I think above all, now we can see that this movement is really nihilistic in that it's motivated more by what it wants to destroy
Yeah.
than what it actually wants to create. I mean, just look at Doge right now.
Yeah.
They're taking a sledgehammer approach in ways that are going to be incredibly costly. So, for instance, they're sabotaging the IRS's ability to collect taxes, which is going to diminish receipts, right? And increase cheating. They're canceling contracts midstream, which wastes money. They're
Right.
starting these needless trade wars that are raising the prices of goods and for American consumers. And they're destroying consumer protection agencies that have returned billions of dollars to American taxpayers. So it's clear that this process is really not about reducing waste. Is there waste in government? Of course, just
Yeah.
as there is in the private sector. But they're also creating a tremendous amount of opportunity for fraud and a sort of appetite for destruction. So the process is clearly driven by more ideological motivations than anything else. I think Musk, the richest man in the world, basically captured the basic thinking when he showed up with a chainsaw and he's gonna, go after grandma's Social Security. Um, I actually think that this nihilism is also evident in the moral cowardice of leaders of the Republican Party. And we can point to this, like think about the Hegseth Signal Group.
Yes.
Members of this administration are flat out denying what we can all see
Yes.
happening with our own eyes. They engaged in this incredibly dangerous breach of security. They did so without following lawfully prescribed processes. They lie to our faces about this, and no Republican leaders or major Republican leaders, as of this moment, as far as I can tell, appear to be really standing up for the national interest. So I think that this is the kind of behavior of people who appear to have contempt for democracy, and they believe that there's nothing of value more than power. And I think that, we need to, of course, government is never perfect and there's always room for improvement, but we need to remind people of the many good things that government does and can do, along with the many bad things that happen when you have a lack of a effective government, or when you have a government that just provides for sort of theft from the top, kind of cronyistic kleptocracy, where the dear leader and his inner circle are the ones who get to enrich themselves. And I think we can point to examples of this around the world. Let's look at Russia. Let's look at leaders in Iran, okay? It's not just, let's look at Erdogan in Turkey. When these or Orban in Hungary, when these leaders bind themselves to ultra-conservative figures in their own countries, sort of sanctimoniously saying, I got the holy men on my side, look, we've
Yes.
got God on our side, they're not necessarily really trying to establish a pure theocracy because, holy scriptures can be interpreted in all kinds of different ways. What they're really doing is sort of consolidating authoritarian power and and depriving the people of their rights, their right to free speech, their right to political opposition. They're like protecting themselves from investigation of the abuses that they're perpetrating against their own people. And on balance, they're enriching themselves and the people at the very top, their allies. And we've seen this happen over and over again around the world and throughout history.
And I know we have a tight window, so I want to be respectful of that because you've got other things to do than to talk to me and my handful of listeners. So I appreciate you being here. If people want to contact you or read stuff online
Thank
or
you so much. I post much of what I write on katherinestewart.me. It's my website, and I update it from time to time. I'm also, Money Lies in God Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy is sold wherever books are sold. Um, and I'm on Blue Sky, Katherine Stewart at Blue Sky. I'm also still on Twitter, Kath S. Stewart. And yeah, thank you so much for the conversation, Phil. It's really great to speak with you.
where are you going to be this summer or fall? I think you have maybe one or two things. You,
Yeah, various things happening in the fall. So
yeah.
it's been a busy season and a lot to write about. Unfortunately, we're sort of
Yeah.
seeing it all happen right before our eyes. So I think it's going to be, there's so many wonderful journalists out there working in this field. When I started writing on this topic 16 years ago, those of us, it was a much smaller group who were following this story, and we were often dismissed as alarmists. I remember, people were, Obama was the president, and people would say to me, "What are you talking about?" The big story in religion journalism was the rise of the nuns, the so-called nuns, people who don't particularly have any religious faith, and I and others would say, no, 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 this movement is organizing. I remember Michelle Goldberg's fantastic book, I think it's 2006 or 2007, titled Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, is one of the first books on the topic that I read. And it really opened my eyes. And I started, seeing this thing happen in my neighborhood and then recognizing that it was attached to this national organization that had these other alliances and was working with sort of all these other organizations was really astonishing to me.
And we
Um,
didn't even get into it because we're running out of time, of course. But guys, ladies and gentlemen, buy the book because Catherine went to all kinds of events, events that would make your stomach churn, to collect notes, to get information, to document who's who inside of this movement. Absolutely fantastic. Catherine, thank you so much for coming on the Phil Ferguson Show. I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. Great to speak with you today.